Well, thank you very much. Thank you, Raza, and all the wonderful team of artists that are gathered here. And well, thank all of you for being here to listen. And well, this talk stems from my ongoing research at the University of Buenos Aires, where I explore the intersections between philosophy, artistic practices, and vegetal life. And okay, I would like to start by thinking through an expression that is very interesting, I think, and that is the open air laboratory. And this is a phrase that circulates across very different discursive fields, at least in my country, scientific, environmental, and artistical. And it condenses a profound ambivalence. On the one hand, it evokes curiosity, exploration, and experimentation in the open. And on the other, it names the violence of exposure, extraction, and dispossession. In Latin America, this expression carries a specific weight. In Argentina, it has been used in the media and in public discourse to describe a double reality. On one side, the biodiversity of wetlands and forest reserves is celebrated as a natural laboratory, a place where nature itself experiments on itself. On the other, rural communities surrounded by genetically modified soybean fields denounce that they are living inside a massive open-air experiment or laboratory, as artist here present, Julia Mensch, has reflects in her artistic practice. The same phrase, so repeated across this context, reveals an epistemic fracture. What interests me is not to resolve this ambivalence, but to unfold it, to understand what it says about our contemporary condition, a condition in which the boundaries between laboratory and environment have become porous. This expansion of experimentation into the open air is not only technological, it is aesthetic. It transforms our sensorium, our very capacity to perceive and imagine what life is. And it also reveals that experimentation has never been neutral. It is distributed unevenly across the world, and it often unfolds along the same colonial and economic asymmetries that structure global modernity. Some bodies and territories become privileged sites of knowledge production, while others become the matter of experimentation itself. In this sense, the open-air laboratory exposes a paradox. The more we claim to study the environment, the more we participate in its reconfiguration. The Earth becomes an experimental surface, monitored, optimized, and rearranged through instruments of measurement, data, and control. But to think this expansion only in terms of domination would be insufficient. What interests me are also the counter practices, the forms of artistic and ecological experimentation that unfolds within and against the open-air regime. Practices that transform exposure into attention, observation into resonance, and measurement into care. The festival in which we meet today is itself part of this movement. It reclaims the vegetal not merely as object or theme, but as a site of thinking, as a medium through which aesthetic and political imagination can be reactivated. This is why I insist on approaching plants not as metaphors, but as theoretical and aesthetic operators. To think with plants means to rethink the relation between perception and world, between aesthetics and ecology, between technology and form. It means to pay attention to an ecology of relations, to say it with Isabel Stenchers, in which world and perception are co-constitutive. From this perspective, the open-air laboratory can also be read as a planetary condition of experimentality. the air, the soil, the atmosphere itself becoming sites of techno-scientific inscription and aesthetic intervention. To study this condition demands a vocabulary capable of traversing philosophy, art, and material ecology. A vocabulary that allows us to speak of the aesthetic operations of plants, of the politics of visibility that technological mediation imposes, and of the imaginaries through which we inhabit damaged worlds. In what follows, I will move through a series of conceptual constellations that guide my work. My argument, in short, is that thinking through plants allows us to reconfigure the relation between aesthetics and ecology, and that this reconfiguration is crucial if we are to understand the politics of world-making in the Anthropocene. The vegetal is not only an object of ecological concern, it is also a mode of thought, an aesthetic regime, and a technology of relation. And here is where this slide comes. To understand how the open-air laboratory has become the dominant mode through which the world is organized and perceived, we must first revisit the longer history of agriculture, not only as a technical practice, but as a form of thought. Modern philosophy, as well as modern science, are rooted in what Timothy Morton calls agri-logistics, the logistical program of the agricultural revolution that took place 12,000 years ago. This was not merely a technological shift, it was an epistemic one. It established a new ontology of life, one based on the predictability of the environment, the separation between human and non-human, and the dream of controlling contingency through the planning of the field. The field, in this sense, becomes not just a surface for cultivation, but a prototype for modern rationality, a grid where difference is domesticated, temporality is synchronized, and production is subordinated to optimization. In Latin America, the colonial plantation system inherited and radicalized this logic. The plantation is a cosmotechnical structure that articulates labor, land, and life according to the principles of scalability. It is a device for transforming heterogeneous ecologies into homogeneous surfaces of extraction. This is why the plantation is not a closed historical episode, but a planetary diagram that persists in contemporary infrastructures, from soybean monocultures to data farms. Both function through the same logic of scalability, a logic that seeks to replicate and extend operations across space and time without loss of efficiency. Scalability, as Anat Singh suggests, is a condition that allows capitalism to appear as a global ecology. It converts living processes into units of equivalence, making them interchangeable and manageable at any scale. In this process, the material heterogeneity of life, its textures, its rhythms, is systematically erased. The open-air laboratory is, in this sense, the contemporary manifestation of the plantation condition. It extends the agri-logistical program into the atmosphere. The air becomes the new field, monitored by satellites, drones, and predictive models. The same logic of optimization that once organized crops now governs carbon cycles, weather patterns, and even the imaginaries of sustainability. Yet, this expansion is not only economic or technological, it is also aesthetic. It transforms how we perceive and represent the world. The cartographic and optical systems that sustain agri-logistics are also systems of sensibility. Think, for example, of the aerial image, that seemingly neutral view from above that captures the land as data. That image, those kinds of images, are not innocent. They produce a perspective of mastery that reaffirms the hierarchical separation between observer and observed. But it also reveals the extent to which vision can be absorbed into logistics. Seeing becomes a form of planning, and perception becomes part of production. In this visual regime, plants are no longer beings that grow. They are indicators, parameters, or units of measurement. Their material and affective presence becomes abstracted into a quantitative code. What disappears is the vegetal as an excess, as relational rhythm, as open-ended process. The disappearance we are talking about is not accidental. It is constitutive of the agri-logistical worldview. The plantation depends on the suppression of what cannot be scaled, the singular, the relational, the unrepeatable. It is an aesthetics of uniformity that equates visibility with control. From a Latin American perspective, this has deep implications. Our territories are not only sites of production, they are sites of epistemic tension. They expose the persistence of a colonial logic that continues to operate under the guise of modernity and development. The monoculture is not just an agricultural phenomenon, it's a cognitive one. It imposes a monoculture of perception. To speak of agri-logistics and scalability, then, is also to speak of the politics of the sensible. It means recognizing that the aesthetic dimension, how we see, sense, and also how we imagine, is not external to production, but one of its conditions of possibility. At the same time, this recognition opens a space for counter-practices. Because if agri-logistic operates by erasing heterogeneity, then every resurgence of difference can become an act of interruption. In art, in philosophy, and in ecological practices, this interruption may take the form of reattuning to the vegetal, to the slow, recursive rhythms of growth and decay that may defy the linear time of productivity. To engage aesthetically with plants is to recover the unprogrammable dimension of life. This is not nostalgia for a pre-technological state of the world. It is the recognition that within the very systems of control, there are still traces of other logics, other modes of relation, other modes of attention. If the plantation is the dominant image of scalability, we could say that the plant itself is its internal limit. It grows according to patterns that are repeatable yet never identical, structured yet open to contingency. In that paradox between rule and variation, iteration and difference, lies the possibility of another thought. And this is precisely where art becomes crucial, because artistic practices, understood as the cultivation of perception, can reveal the latent sensibilities that the agri-logistical regime seeks to suppress. Art, in this sense, is not the opposite of techniques. It is a counter-technical operation, one that reclaims perception as a field of relational invention. When I speak of plants as ecological maps, I do not mean that they represent their environment from a distance as an image or a symbol. I mean that they compose it, that their growth, morphology, and responsiveness articulate a living diagram of relations. Their kind of mapping is material and is affective. A map, in the most general sense, is a way of organizing perception. It connects what can be sensed with what can be acted upon. In this sense, plants are cartographers of the real. Through their physiology, they register variations in light, humidity, and temperature. Through their bodies, they trace lines of relation between soil, atmosphere, and other beings. They translate environmental intensities into material gestures. Every leaf, every stem, every root is an inscription, a response to a specific set of conditions, a decision made in matter. Plants do not stand outside the world they inhabit. They draw it into themselves, metabolizing its chemical and energetic flows. They are both the subjects and the archives of ecological history. This is why I consider the vegetal not as a passive figure, but as a cognitive and aesthetic operator. Plants think, we could say with Michael Marder, but they do so without brains, without language, and without representation. It is a kind of attention that is distributed across tissues, organs, and temporalities. And it is precisely this distributed attention that makes plants crucial figures for rethinking aesthetics today. The vegetable map is not a fixed representation. It is a dynamic field of response ability, to say it with Donna Haraway. This is what distinguishes vegetal mapping from the cartographic logics of agrilogistic. Plants compose the world. They make difference proliferate. In this sense, every plant is both an archive of violence and a vector of possibility. Take, for example, the transgenic soybean plant that dominates vast regions of Argentina. It is a biological artifact designed for efficiency, standardized and optimized to perform within a global network of logistics. As such, it embodies the logic of scalability and extraction. And yet, even within that logic, it maintains a residual agency. It grows, it mutates, it adapts. It records the chemical, economic, and atmospheric conditions of its environment. Seen from this angle, the plant is not a mere victim of technoscience. It is also a witness and a participant. To think of the soybean as an ecological map is to understand it as a living diagram of global capitalism. A map that shows not only the reach of agro-industrial power, but also the fragility of its own foundations. The plant thus becomes a kind of sensorium, a sensorium of immersion, of being in contact, and as such, it registers the world from within. I think. No. The inversion of perspective, this inversion of perspective has profound aesthetic implications. It challenges the modern distribution of the sensible that privileges the human eye, the view from above, the image as instrument of control. The vegetal aesthetic operates otherwise. It is an aesthetics of proximity, of touch, of entanglement. To think of plants as ecological maps means that artistic practices can learn from vegetal logic. Many contemporary artistic experiments that engage with plants, installations, bioart, performative ecologies like we are having in this festival, do not simply use plants as material. They use them as co-authors, as agents of transformation. These practices do not produce images of nature. They produce sensorial situations with nature. They operate in what could be called a post-representational aesthetics, one that aligns more with the vegetal logic of relation than with the anthropocentric logic of depiction. What art shares with plants in this sense is the capacity to make the world appear differently. Artistic practices are like photosynthesis because they transform exposure into energy and appearance into relation. From a philosophical perspective, this redefinition of aesthetics demands that we move toward an ecological understanding of sensibility. Aesthetics, in this expanded sense, is not about taste or beauty. It is about the conditions of perception and relation that make world-making possible. Plants remind us that these conditions are always material and situated. Perception is not an abstraction. It is mediated by bodies, environments, and technologies. The vegetal thus exposes the aesthetic as a field of material experimentation, a domain where sensing and being sensed are inseparable. In the open-air laboratory that the world has become, this shift is crucial. It means that to perceive is to participate, that to sense is already to intervene. And it means that aesthetic practices, far from being an adornment of politics, are one of its most fundamental operations. And this is why I see plants as models for thinking the aesthetics of relation. Their intelligence is relational, and their form is not the expression of an internal essence, but the outcome of constant negotiation with the world. In much contemporary philosophy, ecology is no longer confined to the study of organisms and environments. It has become a paradigm for understanding the relations that sustain existence in its technical, aesthetic, and political dimensions. This is what I could call, following Eric Hurl, general ecology. General ecology describes a world in which technologies, images, infrastructures, and living forms all participate in the same circuits of exchange and transformation. Under this view, there is no pure nature waiting to be protected from contamination, nor a separate sphere of techniques opposed to life. From this perspective, the environment appears not as a background, but as a dense, stratified field of mediation. Climate systems, data networks, vegetal metabolisms, and aesthetic practices all operate as ecological forces. What connects them is their capacity to translate, to transform flows of energy and information into perceptual and material forms. Within this framework, every act of sensing is also an act of exchange. Every image, every signal, every sound participates in the metabolism of the world. This is why the aesthetic cannot be separated from the ecological. Both concern the organization of relations between forms, sensations, and meanings. The challenge, then, is to describe the present not only as an ecological crisis, but as an aesthetic one, a crisis of perception, of attention, of sensibility. The climate emergency, the loss of biodiversity, and the saturation of digital images are not separate phenomena. They are symptoms of the same reconfiguration of the sensorium. In this reconfiguration, technologies play a decisive role. Satellites, sensors, drones, and algorithms extend perception beyond the human scale, translating environmental processes into visual and numerical data. They produce what I call the artifactual sensorium, a system of perception in which biological and technical agencies are intertwined. In the global south, our territories are mapped and monitored by infrastructures that often belong to distant corporations or states. The air, the soil, and even the seeds are incorporated into global circuits of data and control. The open air, once the emblem of freedom, becomes a laboratory of algorithmic governance. However, this artifactualization of the sensorium does not entail the disappearance of the living. On the contrary, it reveals the extent to which life itself has always been technical, always entangled with processes of translation. Photosynthesis, as I was saying, is a natural technology, a biochemical interface that converts light into energy. Every leaf is a sensor, every root is an instrument of communication. To think of plants in this way is not to mechanize them, but to acknowledge that translation is not a human invention. It is a property of life. Recognizing this continuity allows us to rethink the relation between art, ecology, and technology. Artistic practices that engage with sensors, networks, or databases are not simply using technological tools. They are participating in the broader ecology of translation that constitutes the world. In this sense, the artifactual sensorium is both a condition and a terrain for aesthetic intervention. When artists transform data into affect, or they transform measurement into experience, they reorient technology toward sensibility. This reorientation is crucial because the artifactual sensorium can function either as an instrument of control or as a medium of attunement. In its dominant form, the logistical extractive form, it quantifies and optimizes. But in its experimental aesthetic form, it can also open spaces of resonance, where the technical and the vegetal meet in unexpected ways. And this is why I speak of a general ecology rather than a technological ecology. General ecology recognizes that every mediation, every artifact, and every image is part of the world's metabolism. It shifts the focus from opposition to composition and from purity to relation. In the open-air laboratory in which we live in, perception has become both a tool and a battleground. To engage with it aesthetically is to reclaim the possibility of perceiving otherwise, of crafting new alliances between sensing and being. When I refer to algorithm vegetals, I am not invoking a metaphor, but naming a transformation in the history of knowledge. The moment when vegetal life becomes both model and material for thinking about processes of generation, iteration, and form. The transformation begins historically with the mathematical formalization of growth. The study of branching patterns, phyllotaxis, and leaf distribution led to the development of generative models that sought to describe plant morphology through rules rather than representations. In the 1960s, Aristide Lindenmayer proposed a system of recursive equations, what would be called later the L systems, which were capable of producing, through simple algorithms, the complex architectures of vegetal form. What these models revealed was that complexity could arise from repetition and variation, from the iterative application of minimal rules. They provided a grammar of growth, an algorithmic description of how life unfolds through iteration. In this sense, they made visible a structural affinity between biological and computational processes. But the implications of this affinity extend far beyond mathematical botany. Once plant life could be rendered algorithmically, it became possible to simulate, manipulate, and optimize it. The vegetal entered the domain of design and computation, where its logic of self-organization was translated into the language of control. This is the point at which the figure of the algorithmic plant becomes conceptually charged. The relation between biology and technology becomes circular. Life generates algorithms that then reconfigure life. To call something algorithmic is to describe a mode of becoming that is procedural, iterative, and rule-based. To call something vegetal is to evoke a mode of being that is plastic, relational, and open-ended. The conjunction of these two terms, algorithmic, vegetal, brings forth a productive tension, the tension between determination and contingency, between order and variation. In contemporary technoscientific ecologies, this tension becomes visible in the proliferation of computational models that attempt to replicate or accelerate natural processes. Photosynthesis is simulated as a circuit of optimization. Plant evolution is rewritten as an algorithmic problem of efficiency. The vegetal becomes an experimental platform for designing the future, a future of bioengineered adaptability, synthetic photosystems, and programmable ecologies. These operations are not only technological, but also aesthetic. They redefine what counts as form, what counts as growth, what counts as life, and so on. In the process, they generate new images of the vegetal, images that oscillate between fascination and anxiety. Okay, not yet. This is where the concept of the zombie plants, which I developed elsewhere, becomes relevant. Zombie plants are not metaphors for death. They are biotechnological forms of life that persist in the logic of optimization. They are living artifacts designed for productivity, genetically standardized and functionally simplified. Their vitality is reduced to operativity. Yet they remain alive, which means that they continue to act, to sense, and to interfere. They are, in a way, the undead of agrilogistic, entities that expose the persistence of life within the circuits of control. And I talk about zombie plants when I talk about the soybean monocultures. But to think about algorithm vegetals, therefore, is not only to critique the technoscientific appropriation of plant life, but also to engage with the epistemological and aesthetic questions that arise from it. What happens when growth becomes an algorithmic function? Can we imagine algorithms that learn from the indeterminacy of matter rather than seek to eliminate it? These questions are not abstract. They have concrete implications for how we understand both art and ecology. In generative art, for instance, the recursive logic of vegetal growth has inspired forms of creation that are not based on representation, but on emergence. In doing so, they reclaim the algorithmic not as a mechanism of control, but as a medium of exploration. This aesthetic appropriation of the algorithmic vegetal points to a broader shift, from a paradigm of representation to one of process. In this sense, the vegetal logic of growth becomes an aesthetic principle, one that values variation over repetition, openness over predictability. And I think there is a very good example in this festival with the work of Rasa Smith. From a philosophical standpoint, then, that this principle challenges the modern opposition between nature and artifice. What emerges is a continuum of technicity, a general condition of relational operation that traverses both living and non-living systems. This continuum does not erase difference, it multiplies it. It requires developing what I would call vegetal techniques, practices of composition that take their cue from the plant's way of inhabiting the world, slow, distributed, porous, and responsive. Vegetal techniques is not a metaphor for ecological art. It is a mode of existence. It proposes that to think ecologically today is to think technically, and that to think technically is to think aesthetically. It is to acknowledge that the problem of the planet is not simply the overreach of technology, but the impoverishment of our imagination of technicity. To reimagine techniques from the vegetal standpoint is to rediscover its aesthetic dimension. It points to a future in which intelligence is no longer the privilege of control, but the practice of attunement. A future in which art, ecology, and technology converge in the cultivation of shared sensibility. To conclude, I would like to return to the notion of vegetal techniques. Throughout this talk, I have suggested that plants are not simply biological entities or metaphors of vitality, but conceptual figures that allow us to rethink the very conditions of existence in the Anthropocene. They remind us that to live is to relate, to sense, and to compose, and that these acts are always technical as well as aesthetic. In the modern imagination, technology has been associated with control, mastery, and acceleration, while plants have been linked to passivity, slowness, and receptivity. But if we look more closely, we realize that the vegetal and the technical share a common ground. Both are modes of translation, and both are forms of transformation. Every root is a sensor, every leaf a solar interface, and every seed a storage device of potential. To think with plants is to acknowledge that life itself is technical, that technicity is not an invention of modernity, but a property of matter in relation. This recognition transforms the way we approach the question of ecology. Instead of opposing technology to nature, we can understand ecology as a technique of composition, a continuous experimentation with material, energies, and forms of attention. From this point of view, the problem is not the existence of technology, but the narrowness of our imagination of what technology can, may, or should be. Vegetal techniques proposes another imagination, one that learns from the temporalities, sensitivities, and relational capacities of plants. It invites us to cultivate technical practices that are not extractive, but responsive, not predictive, but adaptive. It asks us to think of growth as a mode of intelligence, one that does not dominate its environment, but negotiates with it. This paradigm does not reject the artifactual sensorium, it transforms it. It recognizes that we live within infrastructures that are simultaneously ecological and technological, and that the task is not to escape them, but maybe to reconfigure their rhythms. To reattune the sensorium is to reorganize the very conditions of perception and thus the possibilities of world making. From a Latin American perspective, this reconfiguration is inseparable from the histories of land, extraction, and resistance that shape our territories. The open-air laboratory is not an abstract metaphor here. It is a lived reality, one that extends from the poisonous monoculture fields to the digital infrastructures that now map and manage our ecosystems. To speak from this position is to insist that ecology is not a universal neutrality, but a site of conflict, invention, and situated knowledge. In this context, art and philosophy can act as translators themselves, not by representing the world, but by participating in its ongoing composition. They can amplify the subtle forms of intelligence that persist within the vegetal and the algorithm alike. They can reveal that sensing, like thinking, is never purely human. To practice a vegetal techniques, then, is to reimagine creation as care. It is to think of technique not as domination, but as attention. It means accepting that to compose is also to expose oneself to transformation. Every gesture of making becomes an act of listening, an act of cohabitation. This perspective also demands a new politics of scale. The plant connects the microscopic and the planetary through gradients of growth for itself and for all the other forms of being on Earth. To think ecologically today may mean to inhabit this scalar fluidity, to move between the cellular and the climatic, the local and the global, paying attention to the specific of every alliance and every conflict. Perhaps this is the deepest lesson of vegetal thought, that intelligence is not about knowing, but about attuning, about maintaining sensitivity to the rhythms of what exceeds us. Plants embody this intelligence through their capacity to persist without sovereignty and to flourish in the midst of exposure. So when we think of the future, of the technological, the ecological, the artistic, perhaps we might imagine it as a proliferation of relations, a future that grows rather than expands, and that connects rather than extracts, that listens rather than predicts. In such a future, to think, to create, and to care would no longer be separate acts. They would be, as they are in the plant, different expressions of the same impulse, the impulse to sustain life through the proliferation of relation, a way of sensing the world not from above, but from within, its continuous unfolding. Thank you.